So, long time no see. Not going to get into all the details of all that. What we got here today is a 2013 Dodge Charger SRT8 with the 392 Hemi. You guys may notice a couple different things under the hood here. We've got our oil catch can set up over here. We've got a nice old Super Pro Charger set up here. This car was actually originally equipped with a Whipple supercharger. Had a nitrous setup on it. They pulled the engine out of it. For a little history behind it, they pulled an engine out of it maybe a month or two ago, something like that, if I remember correctly. Put different upgraded connecting rods, upgraded pistons in it, new piston rings, switched over to the Pro Charger setup, got rid of the nitrous, and ran it on the dyno, did a PCM tune. Actually went to go and recharge the AC system, and the car began to exhibit a no crank. Now, the car will not crank. It is a push-button ignition system. It will not crank. If you bypass the starter relay, jump pins 30 and 87, while somebody's pushing the push button, the car will start and run under its own power. So that right off the bat gives us a little bit of direction, but it also throws a lot into the works. I mean, we got to look at what's been done to the car. Engine's been out, so we have potential ground issues, potential pinched wire harnesses. We've got a potential for problems within the PCM tune itself. You know, there's a lot of variables to consider when dealing with performance vehicles that have been tuned and modified in ways beyond stock. We all know it can be difficult enough to deal with a stock vehicle and lacking service information, let alone when we start making major modifications. It really throws a lot of things to the wind and can make it a little bit more interesting. I know not everybody wants to deal with these tuned and modified vehicles, but I do like a challenge, so we're going to see what we got here, and it's actually a pretty interesting failure. So I'm going to tell you guys right off the bat that we're going backwards on this one. This is one I went through, I diagnosed it, and decided after the fact that I wanted to make a video on it because it is an interesting failure and a failure mode that I have not seen on anything before, be it heavy equipment, heavier medium-duty trucks, or automotive. So we're going to do this a little differently. We're going to spend a lot of time going through the service information and really necking down what we need to know, what we don't need to know, what that information is telling us. A little bit of time on the scan tool, and honestly, no scope work here. Regular old multimeter, that's all we really needed to dive down into this and be able to diagnose it correctly. So let's get started. So how I started off this diagnosis was the fact that I'm gonna treat this like a regular no crank situation, at which point I pulled up the schematic, found that there was a conventional starter relay, in this case a Bosch 5-pin relay, quite a ubiquitous relay, but standard Bosch 5-pin relay that controls the starter. So with any 5-pin relay, we have our terminal 30, which is going to be our constant power. We have our terminal 87, which is going to be our load. And then we have 85 and 86, which are going to be the coil control to switch over the relay. What we're going to be using for just more demonstration purposes here is a relay shorting plug. So this will directly jump pins 30 and 87. So as soon as we plug this in, if this fuse is in place, we're going to be cranking the starter over. So just to give you a quick demonstration of that. Why are we going to the starter relay first? It's a quick, easy way to split the system in half. It lets us know what we do have, what we don't have, and which direction we want to go. No disassembly needed. We pop the hood, we pull the relay or the fuse box cover, and it's right there. So it's a nice middle of the road point to send us in one direction or the other and avoid any unneeded disassembly. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to pull the fuse out of this shorting plug so that it doesn't sit there and just crank the starter over till the cows come home. And what we're really going to be paying attention to is this red LED right up top. This LED will light if we have both coil control power and ground. So if we're missing one or the other using this method, we still have to see, are we missing the power or are we missing the ground? But for demonstration purposes, it will work. It's just something to keep in mind if you're using these for diagnostic purposes. So what I'm going to do here is plug this in, and I'm going to hop into the car here and crank it over. So what we're going to do as I'm coming over here is we want to pay attention to whether or not that LED lights. And at this point, we're cranking over, dashboard, the radio goes blank, dashboard cycles, all like we would normally see during a regular cranking event. And ignition back off. And you will notice that we had absolutely no illumination of the LED. So that means we're missing either coil power, coil ground, or both. In this case, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, we are missing both coil power and coil ground. We're going to delve into how that's controlled within the service information portion here. We're going to kind of bounce back and forth between on car and in shop to give you guys the best experience and the best explanation of this and how I went through it.
All right, so here we got a list of all the codes that was in it, whole laundry list of codes. Implausible left rear wheel speed signal received. Does have a bad ABS sensor, wasn't concerned with that. Lost comms with TCM, cluster CCN, implausible messages. I mean, a whole mess of them. Part of that was probably from being disassembled and, give me a second here. Disassembled and, tuned and everything else. So I did go through all lost comms, humidity sensor module. That was a reoccurring fault. Not concerned with that either. So let's get into how this starting system actually works. So in this case, and we're going to kind of blow through this as quick as possible, we just want to learn all the interlocks on it and go from there. So when you press the keyless go button, request is sent to the RF hub via the private LAN. So now we know the RF hub and the keyless button right on the dashboard communicate on a LAN network. Once the RF hub receives the request, it looks for a valid key via the passive entry antennas, which are connected directly to that RF hub. So we know we want to be checking and looking at the RF hub. If the RF hub detects a valid key, it sets the ignition position to start crank. BCM then turns the ignition status to start crank. BCM sends a command to turn the vehicle to the run crank if conditions are correct to start. The PCM turns on the high side of the relay and holds the high side until the PCM turns off the signal, allowing the engine to crank. All right, so we know we've got, at this point, we know we've got a key that needs to be recognized by the antenna that is connected to the RF hub. Ignition switch in the RF hub communicate via a LIN bus. BCM gets its message over the network to change to run to crank from our RF hub. Then the PCM and the BCM communicate back and forth to allow the starter relay control to occur. If the BCM is still in crank and the crank hold signal is true, then the BCM turns on the low side of the relay and the engine will start cranking. So first, the powertrain module's got to be happy. That's part one. Once we command that crank, PCM's got to be happy first. That supplies the high side to our relay control. And then if the BCM agrees, it will send the low side, thereby switching over that relay. If you recall, we had neither high nor low side. But from this, we're looking at the PCM first, because that goes high side. At least in theory, I mean, this should be almost instantaneous. So, where were we? Once the engine is started, the PCM deactivates the double start override. The BCM will then deactivate the starter either when the engine starts or the maximum time has been reached for the tip start, 10 seconds gas, 25 seconds diesel. So we know it'll only crank a certain period of time before starting. Okay, pretty standard. At the same time the engine starts, the RF hub will put the ignition from crank to run if the start type is tip start, or the 2-second time expires, or the engine controller indicates the vehicle is not in park or neutral. And then it just lets us know the engine can be manually shut down by the driver with speeds over 5 miles per hour in any gear. So we know we want to look at this RF hub. We want to see what's going on in the RF hub. I don't believe I did this in the previous section of the video, but we do know that the ignition is turning on. The doors are locking and unlocking with the key fob. So we should feel pretty confident that it is recognizing the key fob, but we at least have a general idea here. So now if we go to our schematic, we have what here is a real basic layout of everything going on here. So we got our phobic, we've got our key and ignition button, our comms here, passive antennas, and this is kind of an interaction chart, a basic setup, how everything's talking, which modules are going where. So it's not a bad setup. Now up here we have our basic setup for our schematic. So let's try to get this in a little more. So right here we have our standard starter relay. We have our fuse battery positive, which is going to be our terminal 30. We have our starter control for the motor. That's going to be our yellow gray. That's going to be 87. And then 85 and 86 here. Starter override relay control, relay coil return, smart starter relay coil. So the smart starter relay coil is going to be going right down into our BCM. So we know that's going to be our low side control here, right? Because through our theory, we know that the PCM first is going to control on the high side, which is right here. Ooh, let me scroll up a little bit for you guys. So we have our starter override relay coil. So this is going to be our power feed if the PCM sees what it wants to see from our RF hub. And then we're going to go and we're going to send a ground signal. If the PCM and BCM agree, we're going to send that ground signal through this light blue tan up into the fuse box. That's going to switch our starter relay over. And then that's going to send power all the way down to our starter solenoid. Pretty basic system, so it seems. Obviously, we are going to look at the fact that we have park neutral switches. We've got key fob position itself. There are different ignition modes. So we're going to go through step by step and kind of narrow this down because we have a tuned PCM. So there's a big variable there, especially knowing the PCM has to like the information it gets from our RF hub. And then it also has to communicate a valid signal to the BCM to allow this starter relay to kick over. Now with a tuned PCM, were there modifications made that are now giving invalid messages on the data bus? It's hard to say. So in this case, we're going to try to prove everything to prove or disprove a software issue or if it's an input issue. And with an input issue, which you'll hear me say this a few times in this, is it a direct input or an indirect input? So, seems simple. We know we don't have either side. So let's start with the RF hub. That's the one that's called out the most in our starting theory of operation. So we start with the RF hub and we go from there.
So what I've got set up here is something I use. I mean, this pretty much stays hooked up to any given scanner that I'm using at that point. This is the AES Wave Smart Bob. It is a breakout box for the DLC. all 16 pins. We got some LEDs here, and it gives us nice, easy banana jacks to go probe, check things, everything else. One, I use it as a way to save my DLC connector on whatever VCI I'm using to communicate with the vehicle. Two, if we flip the switch here, not sure if this will show up on camera well or not, but it gives us a nice battery voltage readout, which is great for a quick, easy battery test if you're, looking at a no crank, no start, something like that, slow crank, whatever it may be. And this one I actually got fully spec'd out, so I've got an isolation switch on it, as well as a communication network isolation switch there. So we're going to be using this along with, I know it's terrible, but we're just going with the Snap-on Veris Edge on this vehicle. It'll do everything we need it to, so let's go to the next step here. All right, so we've got the Veris hooked up here. We are going to press once for accessory position on the push button if for some reason you're not familiar with push button ignitions. Press 2, that'll give us the full on position. And we're going to start with hidden scanner. And we want to load 2013 Dodge Charger SRT8. Yes, we do. That is a HVAC blend door. If you can hear that in the background, that is an HVAC blend door going through its self-test. There's actually an issue there, but that's not the point of this video. We're going to choose Display Fitted Systems List. And I'm not going to bother running a code scan. Like I said, at this point, I've already diagnosed this. In our service information portions, you'll have already seen at this point the initial code scan I got out of this vehicle and some of the directions that led me. So we're going to start with the first step in the system for this RKE, Remote Keyless Entry System, which is going to be our radio frequency hub, or RFH. So we're going to go into our data. Collecting data. And we're going to start scrolling through. This is where we want to look at our data PIDs and really start paying attention to what we see, what we don't see, anything that may not make sense. Richard Falco, when we were out in Kansas City for the Vision High Tech Training Expo, Richard Falco was one of the other presenters at the Tech Talks. That was a real good time. I presented there as well. Richard did a very good class on how important scan data is and how much we can really do with scan data, especially as vehicles continue to advance. And that's something I kind of kept in the back of my mind for this particular diagnosis. So all that being said, I will link out to Train by Techs has the full Tech Talks linked on their YouTube channel, so I'll link out to that, and you guys can watch some of those. Really, really, really great information. So some of the things we see right off the bat are automatic transmission. Yes, that's good. Battery voltage 12.2. That's about right. I don't have a battery maintainer on this. One thing I will say is if you guys are doing diagnoses with a weak battery, questionable battery, or one that you think is going to take a long period of time, I always put a battery maintainer on it. Just saves me a lot of grief and aggravation down the road to avoid low voltage situations that will cause other wonky issues. So I went through, I looked through some of it. We have skim status, we have immobilizer charm default, key 1 authentication status in this point. Authorization is okay, which is good. Commanded ignition status, ignition run, which is what position our ignition switch is currently in. Driver door ajar, obviously. I've got the door ajar for filming purposes. ECU is in normal mode. Now what you'll see here is ECU status, and something I see on Snap-on and I do like is for something we may not understand what other data PIDs or what other statuses a given data PID can be in. Snap-on is pretty good about giving us, in this case, normal mode, abbreviated, whatever it may be, or shipping mode. In this case, we're in normal mode. I feel pretty good about that, as I did before. We'll see brake switch here. And I'm actually going to cycle the brake switch. And we go on, and we go off. So the brake switch, for anybody who's not familiar with RKE systems, you need to have the brake fully depressed and have the controllers recognize that the brake is depressed before hitting the ignition switch to crank over. So we see our RF hub, which is the first link in the system, is recognizing our brake switch input. That's actually not a direct input to the RF hub, and we'll delve into that further in our service information portions. It's one of those things, it's really important to understand what's an input, what's an output, as well as what is a direct input or a direct output and an indirect input or output. And we'll be covering all that in the service info sections as they come in through. Engine speed 0, we're just kind of going through. Gated parking switch. You know, I'm not super familiar with the Chrysler system, so that one kind of threw me off. So what I did was, and if you can, in case you can't see that, I'm in park currently, and our gated parking switch is open. And so what I do is, if I'm not familiar with the data PID, I kind of look at what the description is, what my options are. In this case, I have open and closed. Mentally, I'm treating this as a normal park neutral switch. To confirm that, I'm going to go from park to reverse, and I went from open to closed. I go back to neutral, and right there, we're still in closed, and drive. So in this case, this is literally a park position data PID. So we see that the RF hub is recognizing that it is in park for the transmission. That's going to be important. Vehicles are only going to crank over in park or neutral, not reverse or drive. So that's something that's nice to know. Let's go through a little more here. Message output, fob not detected, is not active, which is nice. That lets us know that the fob is being detected. That's, you know, very important that for these RKE systems, the key fob is detected. We have 2 key fobs programmed. Redundant ignition run start feed output control. We may touch on that a little bit. RKE signal strength is 65%. So our antennas are picking up a signal, 65%. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what a good or bad signal strength is, but 65 seems like a pretty good number to me, you know. Scream, seed request to engine. So we know the RF hub is communicating with the PCM. We have a valid immobilizer key. And like I said, these are all just little things I'm looking through, even if I'm not intimately familiar with the system. These are things I'm looking at to kind of give me a sense of direction. Module wake up reason, the most recent for the RF hub was wake up by the start stop button, which is our push button ignition in the dashboard here. Our Prindle status right now is lever in position park. If we go to R, it's going to be lever in position R, lever in position N, and lever in position D. So we see that the messages being bussed over the CAN bus are getting to the RF hub. Nothing is wonky here. Everything's corresponding. Park is park, reverse is reverse, neutral is neutral, and so on. That lets us know that so far we don't have any kind of conflicts, potential CAN bus corruption, anything along those lines. We're feeling pretty good about that. Let's see what else we got going here. Message output, service keyless system, we don't have a problem. Vehicle is not in park, that's not active. Remote start antenna, power on. Start stop button, we're going to press the button here. And we're going to see, let me actually flip that up for you guys. And we'll do that once more. Our start stop button is going to go from not pressed to pressed while we're in our cranking position. And there is going to be a slight delay here. And see, we're pressed and we're not pressed. So that's all data we're seeing from the RF hub. And so we need to stop and take a look at what comes after the RF hub.